I would just add that our trustees are deeply committed to FPRI, which is attested to by their generous financial support and by their active participation in our many events through the year. Their names may be found on the back of the dinner booklet that was placed in your seats. Among this dedicated group is John Lehman, who was born in Philadelphia, educated at LaSalle College High School, St. Joseph's University, Cambridge University, the University of Pennsylvania. As a former FPRI staffer from 1965 to 1967, he qualifies for the title favorite son, unquote. He went on to become, from 1969 to 1974, special counsel and senior staff member to Henry Kissinger when Dr. Kissinger was National Security Advisor. John served as Deputy Director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency from 1974 to 1976. And then he became a trustee of FPRI and our Vice President from 1977 to 1981. He served as Secretary of the Navy from 1981 to 1987. It's fair to say he was a most effective champion for the concept of a 600-ship Navy. He now works in the private sector, but was called upon by President Bush to serve on the 9/11 Commission, where he served our nation once more. Since 1993, he has rejoined FPRI as a trustee. During his term of trusteeship, he also co-chaired with Harvey Sickerman our Defense Task Force from 1996 to 2002, culminating in our book, quote, America the Vulnerable, Our Military Problems and How to Fix Them. Tonight, we thank him for doing double duty, for giving us a chance to honor his great service to FPRI and to his country, and for delivering our keynote address. I asked John Lehman to come to the podium to receive our award, and I asked Harvey Sickerman to read the certificate award, which, in Harvey's tradition, is a great piece of poetry.
John Lehman we all hold very dear for the obvious reason that he started here. Back in those grim old days of the Soviet threat and Cold War ways, 'twas at FPRI that he acquired his shine that took him to high places in the public line. Throughout the years, we watched him do great things at the NSC Arms Control and the Navy too, where 600 ships only an idea and a thought until John Lehman his genius did wrought, despite Congress, Pentagon, and the armchair set. And of course, no thanks did he get. Here and now, we mean to set that right by acclaiming him this glorious night for patriotism, wisdom, and a certain verve in defending America with courage and nerve to tell the truth, even if it stings, about 9/11, and to do the things so that liberty may live and our people aspire, and thanks to him, we hold our heads higher. So here we proclaim to all who would know, henceforth, John Lehman is a senior fellow.
It's a great trio shot. Okay, great.
You did indeed. Well, thank you very much, Harvey. This is a very humbling evening. It's always such an honor to come back to be among all the members of this rare group, the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Not the least because every time I come, Harvey uses the introduction that my mother wrote for him and keeps updating. And it is definitely true. If it weren't for the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I never would have entered into public service such as it has been from time to time over the years. And it's such a pleasure to see all my old colleagues and old friends and new friends and members of the Institute. I see Brother Renee Sterner, the president of my old school, LaSalle. I remember I joined the Board of Trustees where I served for 6 years at LaSalle some years ago after I left the government. And when I came back, he greeted me and said, "John, you left LaSalle a modest, good-humored boy. It must have been FPRI that made you insufferable." Well, perhaps that's true. But I owe a great debt to the Institute, and it is a truly unique institution in this country. It has really affected the course of history in a way that very few groups of human beings can claim, and affected history in a very favorable way in the intellectual traditions that they developed and the number of people that they sent forth, like Harvey, to advise and to lead this country in its foreign national security policy. Philadelphia is truly blessed to have such a world-class institution rooted here in Philadelphia, and one that, unlike most of the think tanks that have risen during the Cold War, continues to go from strength to strength in helping our leaders in every administration to rigorously understand what really is important in national security affairs. So, Harvey, thank you for inviting me tonight. Last time I was on this podium was a long time ago, and I asked Harvey, well, you remember my last address to the Institute, do you want me to change it anyway? He said, well, John, this time don't try to be charming or witty, just be yourself. So, thank you for that, Harvey. Well, I want to talk tonight about the good news and the bad news coming out of our 9/11 Commission investigations. I'm assuming you have all read our National Book Award nominee report, and so I will just assume a certain level of knowledge as I proceed. But I want to talk about some of the really troubling things that we learned in this investigation, and then talk about some of the good things that we've learned and that have come out of it. First, in the troubling things, Harvey asked me at one point when we were down in Washington this last summer, what were the most shocking things that you learned in this investigation? Now, just to give a quick summary, this investigation started almost exactly 2 years ago. We interviewed 1,250 people from President Clinton and President Bush down to desk officers and CIA operatives and everyone in between. Sworn testimony, thousands upon thousands of hours of interviews and discussions and interrogations. We had access to all the interrogations from Guantanamo and elsewhere of all of the people, including the top al-Qaeda leaders like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who have been captured. We obtained 2.5 million top secret and above documents. We had access to virtually every single piece of information and every person that we knew existed that had bearing on 9/11. And Harvey asked me what were the most shocking things. Well, of course, one of the criticisms leveled against our commission was that we were not above the fray, elder statesman, elder maybe, but not statesman, that we were partisan Republicans and partisan Democrats. And we'd all spent time inside the Beltway. We'd been around the track a number of times. And frankly, it's a little hard to shock people like us that have spent time in the belly of the beast. And yet we were shocked. We were shocked. And the things that shocked me the most may not be the things that you might expect. The first most shocking thing to me after being out of the government since 1987 was the tremendous growth of legalism and lawyers at every level of the policy process. This was a new thing. I mean, there were plenty of lawyers back in the Reagan administration, but the dominance of the legalistic approach to every policy issue was totally new and shocking and frankly debilitating to the policy process. And the second most shocking thing to me was the utter failure of the government, our media, our academics, to grasp the nature of our enemy. Everyone was throwing off terms of talking about terrorism and the threat of terrorism and so forth, but they utterly missed what was going on. They utterly failed to understand the nature of this Islamist terrorist movement. This is not a war against terror. It's like, that would be like FDR saying this is a war against kamikazes. Terrorism is a weapon. It's a method that the Islamist extremists have learned works against free democracies. We've utterly failed to grasp the breadth and the spread, the depth of the enemy that we allowed to develop over some 30 years around the globe. And it wasn't because there weren't warnings. Any traveler, many of you going out to Southeast Asia or traveling through Egypt or in Pakistan could see, and perceptive people wrote about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, this phenomenon of the Salafist, puritanical missionary zeal that was taking over the religious establishment in much of the Islamic world and preaching an aberrant and extremist form interpretation of Islam that was built on hatred, that was calling on all Muslims to rise up and to join the war against the infidels led by the United States. And for 30 years, we ignored it. We ignored also the growth of terrorism in the hands of these Islamists. In 1983, we lost 241 Marines. And our president, who was obviously, as a devotee of President Reagan, I think he's one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. Yet his reaction was, we will bring these terrorists to justice. Let the police handle it. And while he wanted to retaliate, his government did not, so he did nothing. And Osama bin Laden at the time wrote a fatwa saying, look at this. The Americans lose 241 of their sons. And what do? They pack up and run home and leave defeated and do not retaliate. They turn over Lebanon to the Syrians. And time after time, as the Islamists learned that terrorism worked, if you killed Americans abroad, whether it were diplomats in Lebanon or soldiers in Saudi barracks or diplomats in African embassies, you could count on one thing. The Americans would say, we will bring these terrorists to justice, and then do nothing. To me, that was, as we studied these documents, studied the internal papers, studied the recommendations of the top advisors to presidents, we were shocked at the failure to grasp the extent of evil that was stalking us. So that was the second most shocking thing. The third most shocking thing was a culture that had evolved in our government of total non-accountability. Nobody's responsible. After the greatest failure, the greatest disaster in American history of civilians being targeted and successfully attacked, defeating every single defense that we had arrayed against them with confidence, with brazenness so sure that they didn't even bother to have a backup plan. Where you had gross negligence in our State Department granting visas in a sloppy and negligent way, in our Immigration and Naturalization Service paying no attention to people coming in with grossly forged passports, visas that were not even, visa applications not even filled out, stories that were ridiculous. When asked by the terrorists, when they came in, asked by the immigration officers, well, where are you going to school? Oh, somewhere in the West. Well, how are you going to support yourself? Oh, well, I'll find some way. Oh, okay, go ahead. An FAA that was so grossly incompetent that if you will recall, all of you having read the report, your blood boiled at reading the incompetence, the negligence, the lackadaisical attitude that our FAA had in carrying out the simple security procedures like air marshals and like locking cockpit doors that had been learned as lessons after the Lock Irby disaster. Quietly dropped because the airlines didn't want them. They were expensive and all tucked in the memory hole so that by September of 2001, the Al-Qaeda planners knew, didn't just hope, knew that they could cut through our air security without the slightest doubt, that they could carry 4-inch knives, that they could carry mace, tear gas, and be so sure that they didn't even have to have a backup plan. Not one person has been disciplined since that disaster. Incompetence in the FBI that would make your shoelaces dance in terror if you could read the classified material. CIA incompetence and careerism and bureaucratic narrowness that would make you grind your teeth. Not one person disciplined. Not a single person since that attack has been fired or disciplined or even had a letter put in their file. What kind of a culture have we evolved in our government that says nobody's responsible? That, to me, was shocking. So there were many shocking things that sobered us greatly as we went through the process of talking to people, studying the documents. It was shocking to find the brilliance, the tactical brilliance, the judgment, the cool risk assessment of the al-Qaeda leadership. These were not ignorant desert Arabs. These were not people who were wild-eyed fanatics. These were cold, smart, educated, calculating planners who understood how to do disciplined risk assessment, who understood how to analyze the security at Philadelphia compared to Boston and pick Boston because they had a totally incompetent regime in the Boston airport. Comparing one airport to another, comparing one set of airlines procedures with another, taking practice runs up and down the Hudson to calculate the best angles of attack for the World Trade Center, taking practice flights around the Washington area, seeing how hard it was to pick out the White House. Coldly, calmly, effectively planning, using computer analyses to do regression analyses to see the probabilities of using 12 airplanes, which they started their plan with. And finally, through analytical procedures, coming down to limiting it to 4 as the optimum number that would likely not get fall prey to the inevitable failures. These are very effective, smart people, and it was shocking to find that such a broad and pervasive movement of people around the world had come to know one another, help one another, fund one another, all targeted on killing American civilians in the maximum numbers possible. That is why we said in our first finding, the greatest failure of 9/11 was a failure of imagination, a failure of all of us, of all of you, of American leaders, political leaders, of commentators, of media people, congressmen, presidents, a failure to imagine the broad nature of this evil and its effectiveness and its concentrated targeting on the United States and its people. So there were many shocking things. There were other things that, frankly, did not surprise us. The total incompetence of our intelligence establishment. Those of us who had been in government knew that we had evolved an intelligence community, and the community is the very wrong word to use, that had developed so many stovepipes and so many horizontal layers of bureaucracy that it was impossible for common sense and good intelligence to exist. And the reason was that Congress did not want an intelligence establishment that was effective. After Watergate, after Iran-Contra, Congress passed layer upon layer of restrictions and legislations, building these stovepipes so that you would have FBI agents in Phoenix, Arizona with top secret clearances writing memos saying, hey, there are all these young Arab males learning to fly, shouldn't we start investigating them? And simultaneously, analysts at Langley with top secret clearances writing memos saying, you know, we've been analyzing the communications between al-Qaeda people, and they keep talking about using aircraft as missiles, and these people were not allowed, would have been fired if they talked to those people, because Congress prohibited. They did not have a need to know. You can't have people sharing that kind of information. It could lead to abuse. And so the dots were never connected because Congress did not want them connected. They were much more concerned about looking through the rearview mirror, looking at the abuses of people's rights to privacy 20 years ago, and absolutizing that at the expense of any competence in our intelligence capability. That did not shock us. Any of us that had served in the government knew that you could pretty well count on our intelligence community to be wrong in assessing any major potential threat. But nevertheless, we felt that was a fundamental problem that had to be fixed. We could no longer live in a world in which the rights of aliens to privacy and freedom from search, like Mr. Moussaoui, could override the right to have good intelligence about what our enemies were seeking to do to attack us. So there are a large number of things that were very bad, very disturbing, shocking to the uninitiated, not so shocking to us, and many things that even shocked us. And you'll read them all in the report. But I come away from this experience as an optimist. And I think there is an awful lot of good news. And I want to talk about that. First, I think there's the good news of the example that we set in the commission itself. We were 5 Republicans appointed by partisan Republican leadership, appointed because we were Republicans, that we were known to have strong views and to have a certain element of combativeness. 5 Democrats who were picked by the Democratic leadership in Congress for the same reason. Richard Benveniste, who was the prosecutor in the Watergate and President Clinton's impeachment proceedings. Jamie Gorelick, Tim Romer, people that were well known as partisan combatants. So the auguries were not so good when we started that we would ever reach agreement on what really happened as the law required us to do, what lessons to draw as the law required us to do, and most important of all, what we should do about it to fix our vulnerability. And when we had our first meetings, we were very far apart. All of us on the Republican side were sure that the findings would be that President Clinton's fecklessness in not attacking Osama and not taking more proactive measures was responsible. All of the Democrats were sure that President Bush's fixation on Iraq and on missile defense and his total unawareness of the seriousness of the threat was really responsible. So we all, in the first few meetings, set about thinking about how we were going to be writing our dissenting views and how we would handle the inevitable splits and disagreements. But as we proceeded and went through all these interviews and spent time immersed in the documents and talking to all of the players, past and present, gradually a fact pattern filled out that allowed less and less area for disagreement and for policy argument between us, because the facts laid out a dramatic picture in every area. And by June of this year, it was very clear to us, early June, that we had no disagreements on the findings. We didn't have any dissents to write brilliant dissenting views. We had no footnotes even to add to disagree with anything in the report. We were all in agreement, and we did not set out to reach a consensus. None of us intended or even thought it particularly desirable that we be unanimous. But that's where we ended up. We ended up unanimous on everything, on all of the findings, all of the lessons about what went wrong and what was really dysfunctional, and all of the recommendations, all 41 of the recommendations on what to do to fix it. So to me, the good news is if you get people that are serious about it, that are of a certain experience level, who are serious professionals in the policy world, that you can, on the most important issues, make bipartisan, nonpartisan policy and govern in a bipartisan way. All of us have remained totally united on trying to get the reforms through that we all agree are essential. And I think that has helped in Congress, because they have kind of felt that if we could do it, they should be able to do it as well. And that is why both houses have now passed a bill that basically, even in House and the Senate, bills are slightly different, but the House is maybe 90% of our 41 recommendations, Senate 95%. So we will get a bill. We will have the kind of reforms that we have called for in the report, and that is a bipartisan support in both houses. That's good news. That's good news because a lot of people were becoming very cynical about our government process, that maybe it was so broken, so bitter, so partisan that it was impossible to carry out sound government going forward with these kinds of divisions. I think we've shown that that is not necessarily the case, and indeed, in matters of national security, the most partisan Republicans and Democrats can come together and make very good, not mushy consensus, sharp, biting policy recommendations and execute those recommendations. And I think we're going to see that in the intelligence reforms, in the reforms of the aviation safety, the reforms of our immigration and our border security, and even in areas which are less sexy, but for those of us that have to work in high-rises, it may be more important, things like fire codes and emergency preparedness, which are some of our more important recommendations. I would not advise anyone to go above the 6th floor in any high-rise in this city, by the way. So I remain very optimistic after this experience of 9/11. I find an awareness at every level of the government, at the cutting edge, not necessarily at the high policy levels of the assistant secretaries, policy councils, but you go out to the front lines, to the cutting edge, and you talk to the immigration officers that are working Kennedy and the border security people that are out at the border crossings. You talk to the Coast Guard guys that are working the security problem in New York Harbor, Philadelphia Harbor. You have a much more educated, much more enthused and motivated person. They get it. Even if the bureaucracy doesn't get it in some areas, they get it. and we have, I think, a growing understanding of the nature of this threat. It is Islamist terrorism that has been allowed to grow throughout the world with a huge flow of primarily Saudi and other Persian Gulf oil money that has fueled the building of these schools and the sending of these Wahhabi clerics to man the mosques and the chaplaincies in our army and many other armies around the world with us paying no attention. Now people are aware of it. Now people see the problem. People are now addressing the issues, putting the pressure on the Saudis to stanch this flow, to stop the subsidization of the preaching of hatred and jihad with government money and with Saudi charitable money. And it's beginning to have effect. It's going to be a long and difficult haul because we have allowed generations of young Muslims to be raised before they're 7 years old to know one thing certain: to kill Americans is a holy and uplifting thing. That's a terrible, terrible thing that we've allowed to have happen. And as Don Rumsfeld has said, at the rate that when we started this war on Islamist terrorism, we cannot kill them fast enough because they are growing them through these schools and mosques around the world much faster than we could ever deal with them. That is beginning to turn around. And our recommendations are very precise and clear on what we believe on a totally unanimous basis has to be done. First, we have to go and kill them where they are. I'm talking about the trained, committed terrorists, the teams that are organized, that are operating, that are doing their best to obtain nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction from the former Soviet Union or from rogue scientists or whatever. Their top objective is to set off a nuclear weapon in Grand Central Station or somewhere like that to kill the maximum number of innocent Americans. That is their top objective. And we can't sit by and hope we can stop them at our borders. We've got to go kill them first. We've got to stop them from getting those weapons. We've got to deny them the sanctuaries that we permitted them in Sudan, that we permitted them in Afghanistan. We've got to preempt. We've got to be proactive. We've got to go get them. We can't let them take advantage of the fact that there are so many areas of the world where no one's writ runs. And there are many other diplomatic initiatives we have to work carefully with the Egyptians and with the Saudis and with the Pakistanis. It would feel good to give them an ultimatum to say, either you deny Osama bin Laden sanctuary in the Northwest Territories, or we'll come in and get him ourselves. Well, what that would do would bring about his fall and the certain raising up of a Taliban regime in Pakistan, and this would be a Taliban regime with 200 nuclear weapons. So the solutions are not as simple as one might, in our frustration, feel we need to do. But there are a great many of the so-called softer options that are just as important. Militarily, we have to operate proactively, preemptively, and violently against the organized terrorists where they are today. But we also have to deal with the source, and we have to spend money on working with the governments of Egypt and Pakistan, Indonesia, to build schools. Because today, in most of the poor areas of the Islamic world, if parents want a better life for their children, to get them to just learn to read and write, they have only one choice, and that is to send them to the Salafist madrasas to learn to read and write and to hate Americans simultaneously. That's the only option. A tiny bit of money could do so much in these areas, working with these governments to build networks of schools that would teach reading, writing, and arithmetic to these kids, to provide an option different than learning jihad, which is now their only option. Yet year after year, Congress cut out all the money that was requested for these kinds of educational assistance programs. Economic assistance. The whole Arab world has a GDP less than that of Portugal. How, if we don't provide some change of direction so that there's some beginnings of growth, so that there be jobs created, so that there are options for kids in these areas to find a job. There are no jobs being created in these. Well, that's it's a separate, serious sociological issue of what went wrong in Islam that this is the case, but it is the case. But it doesn't have to be the case. We can take a proactive role in providing the support that we did, for instance, with the Asian Tigers in setting up a regional Middle Eastern economic cooperation zone like ASEAN that created the environment that led to this explosive growth in an equally backward area. There's no reason, there's no inevitability why the Islamic world can't do economic activity. We've got to help, we've got to provide the catalyst. We can't just depend on military defenses. We have been abandoning the battle of ideas. This is a quasi-religious war, and a war of ideas, a war in which ideas have consequences, and we have not fought that war. The numbers of hours that we have funded of broadcasting in Pashtun, in the different Arabic dialects, in Farsi, in Urdu, is minuscule. The average Muslim takes his view of what America is like and American values are like from the reruns of Baywatch and from Al Jazeera. We have virtually nothing going on comparatively in international broadcasting, providing a truthful, not a propagandizing, but just an objective source of true reporting of facts of what's going on in the world in the languages of these areas. It's criminal that the amount of money is so small that it would take. One F-22 fighter would fund 3 times what our whole international broadcasting budget is. We've got to make sure that this money is spent. We've got to take just as vigorous and as proactive a role in the war of ideas as we are in the military war against the Islamist terrorists. So these are the recommendations that we've made. The ones that you're all reading about, the legislation creating a national intelligence director and so forth, yes, they're important, but they're very secondary. The most important is first recognize the nature of our enemy and the sources of their hatred, and to recognize there are things we can and must do to deal with it, first militarily and simultaneously to stop the source of this hatred by fighting and winning the war on ideas. So it's for these reasons that all of us on the Commission came away from a fairly sobering 2 years of immersion in these issues as optimists. There isn't one of us that doesn't believe confidently that we can win this war against Islamist terrorism and make a hugely different world in the years ahead. It's not going to be easy, it's not going to be quick, but we will win it, and I think the results of the reactions of people to our report and the implementation of much of it, particularly out at the cutting edge, is proof positive that we are right. We are not being Panglossian, that our optimism is grounded on a confidence in what the American people will inevitably do. And on that note, let me thank you all for your attention and appreciation. Thank you.